All right. Welcome back, everybody. I hope everybody's had a great second day. We've got another great presentation in front of us. Um, this is one that I'm exceptionally interested in. I've been talking to Andrew a lot about some of this stuff. And so what we've got here is Andrew Sama with the University of Notre Dame. He's the Director of Universities Facilities Information. And he's going to be talking about how can space management support flexible work in higher education. So Andrew, I will pass it your way.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. As Chris mentioned, I'm Andrew Sama. I'm the Director of University Facilities Information at the University of Notre Dame. Since 2015, my team and I have been responsible for the collection and maintenance of our floor plan records and the core space and occupancy data for any building that the university owns, operates, or occupies. My favorite part of the job is not really the data management, but it's really finding ways to use the data that my office stewards to improve our university operations. And towards that end, I've spent the last 2 to 3 years building out Notre Dame's first enterprise GIS platform. And that's really how I came to know CFTA. I've been soaking up as much knowledge and expertise as I can from all of you to help me understand first what GIS is, and then how I could use it to make Notre Dame better. And I've learned a ton. I really am just so grateful for all the time and expertise that so many of you have shared with me. Monty Combs, Pamela Locke, Niels LaCour, Aaron Chevront, and so many others that I've met through CFTA have just been so generous with their time and knowledge. So I wanted to try and find some way to give back. So today, despite the fact that I'm really not a facilities or technology expert, I'm jumping in the deep end and I'm going to present to all of you for the first time. So we'll see how this goes. I hope after this you'll still take my calls. All joking aside, I'm very pleased to be talking to you today and trying to answer the question, how can space management support flexible work in higher education? I just want to acknowledge right up front that this entire issue is very complex. The consulting firm McKinsey & Company recently estimated that flexible work is an option for less than half of the U.S. workforce. And I know that the adoption and implementation of flexible work will not be uniform across our industry or even within our institutions. It'll be driven by a whole multitude of factors, including HR policies, institutional culture, and geography, just to name a few. At Notre Dame, we are just starting a year-long pilot program for a few hundred employees to further understand the impacts of flexible work and the potential for long-term adoption. That said, as someone involved in space management at Notre Dame, and admittedly as someone that found flexible work to be pretty great, I'll just put my biases right out there, I wanted to know if and how space management might impact the adoption of flexible work in higher education. I took my best crack at this over the last couple of weeks, and I've got some great help from a number of colleagues, including Chris at Langen. And so I do have some hopefully useful information and learning to share, but I certainly don't have the full answer to the question I'm asking in this presentation. What I do have for you is an exploration of the following 3 areas. What facilities and space data can inform decision-making around flexible work? What technologies support the collection and maintenance, reporting and visualization of that data? And most importantly, how can we use the data and technology that we have to help inform decision-making at our institutions? I'm going to walk through all that, but first, I want to do a little table setting. And I'll start by stating the obvious. I think flexible work arrived in higher education in a big way in 2020. Even my kids were having Zoom meetings. And yes, those are my kids. That is not actually Captain America there on the left. And yes, that is my COVID beard, which now only lives in photos because my wife, Julia, very much did not like it. What people did like, though, is flexible work. By and large, I think it was pretty popular. In fact, in an EDUCAUSE poll that was done in January of 2021, nearly 7 in 10 respondents indicated they either love or like remote work. I'll point out that poll was done, it was higher education focused, but it was IT professionals within higher ed. So perhaps skewing the data a little. I looked around for some other survey data and found that the trend does hold across industries though. Most recently, Glint, which is an HR software firm, released data from surveys of 300,000 employees around the world. So very big sample, showing that only 13% of respondents wanted a return to all office, all the time style of work. Interestingly, not only did employees like this new setup, but there's data to suggest that they were actually maybe more productive as well. In a survey of more than 30,000 Americans published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, 59% of respondents indicated that they were more productive than they expected while working from home. Now, obviously, there's potential for a little bit of bias in there. If your expectations were low, maybe it wasn't hard to exceed them. But the same study actually suggests that we could see up to a 5% productivity boost in the post-pandemic economy due to what they call re-optimized working arrangements, which, as you read through the study, I think just translates to less commuting for people. Now, I'm certainly not going to suggest that everyone loves flexible work or that it's some magic cure-all that's going to make our institutions operate perfectly. Like everything, I think it has pros and cons, and I think it fits different people and different institutions differently. But I think it's safe to say there's enough support for flexible work options among the workforce that this is a trend that higher education institutions are going to have to respond to, and they are responding. You can see here, year over year from May 2020 to May 2021, almost a 5x increase in the paid job listings on LinkedIn in the education sector that offered remote work. But to me, just putting aside surveys, job postings, all that, the biggest indicator that this is going to be part of the future is that we just did it for an entire academic year. It wasn't always pretty or easy, but our colleges and universities operated while most of us were working remote for the last year. And I think it's going to be hard to put that genie back in the bottle. But we're now trying to figure out where is that new normal. And I think we can probably all agree it's going to stabilize somewhere, lower than the highs of flexible remote work that we saw in 2020. You can see here in this data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that already we're down from a high around 60% in May of 2020. We were down to 30% in May of 2021. And as we've discussed throughout this last 2 days, many of us are returning to campus now. That being said, higher education is one of the industries that might have the most potential for flexible work. According to an analysis by the McKinsey Global Institute, somewhere between 33 and 69% of time in the education sector could be spent working remotely in the United States. Now, I'll point out here on this graph, you'll see there's a lot of theoretical in their analysis. The dark blue parts of the bar are what they consider to be, we know they can do this much remote, essentially. And the light blue, which hopefully is showing up for you, indicates, what they think could additionally potentially be done in a remote way. As you can see, the education sector, that light blue bar is bigger than anywhere else on the graph. To me, so I don't know what the optimal landing zone here is, if it's closer to 33 or closer to 70%. But I think that wherever it lands is going to be greatly impacted by space. And I think if I've learned anything in trying to do the research for this presentation is that I've now kind of come to understand that this is going to take years to play out, not months. And so, space is going to be an important factor. And that's because space is a critical resource. It's expensive to create it. It's expensive to sustain it. And generally speaking, as institutions of higher education, we tend to have a lot of it. At Notre Dame specifically, we have more than 200 buildings on and around our main campus, measuring more than 12 million gross square feet. This to serve our roughly 12,000 total students, undergrad and grad. And even in Northwest Indiana, it costs a lot to do construction and maintenance, as you can see here. With any important resource, if we're going to manage it well, we got to measure it. So my first question was, what data is going to be most effective in helping us measure space as it relates to the impact of remote work? Now, I imagine that a lot of this is going to seem very obvious, but I thought it was helpful to list it all out in one place. First and foremost, you need your core space and occupancy data. I imagine that most of you are going to have this in hand, but maybe it's time to think about an update or broad effort for field verification if you haven't, touched this data in a while. But just generally, you got to have your floor plans, your square footage, and FICM-based coding. I also think you need some baseline occupancy data. Now, again, I anticipate most organizations will have org occupancies accounted for pretty well, in my experience, and we'll do a poll here in just a second. I think it may already be in your chat if you wouldn't mind finding that. But I think sometimes organizations do struggle, at least in my experience, with that individual employee level occupancy at the workstation level. This is something my group has worked pretty hard on. If anybody is looking to talk more and learn more about that, we've come up with some decent strategies for it. And I would just say generally, if that's not a data set that you have, it's probably time to start creating it. And again, happy to talk offline with folks about what we've learned and how to do it. Certainly haven't done it perfectly, but we're happy to share whatever lessons we've learned. I'll make a point too here that that type of data not only useful for flexible work considerations, but very useful for emergency response. Next up, I think it's time to get some space use standards and targets if you don't have them. Ideally, this is something that's been negotiated and agreed to in some sort of policy. At Notre Dame, we have a workspace standards document that outlines in painful detail the space ranges associated with various faculty and staff roles. If you don't have something like this in place, I think, again, it's probably time to start coming up with some goals or targets there. Finally, we come to operating costs. This is always the most exciting data. Everyone loves a good ROI number, but sometimes it's the hardest data to get in an accurate way. It was certainly the data that I had the least of at Notre Dame, and that's due in part to the fact that we don't charge for space. So our budget model is a little different. It's just not something I was very focused on in this analysis. I also think as I got into it, that it can potentially be counterproductive to start with financial dollar savings, because it anchors people on a bottom line financial savings that they may not realize unless they're really able to decommission or repurpose the space. So as I show in a minute here, I think it might be more useful to think of your savings in terms of space as opposed to dollars. Before we move along, I hope you've had a chance to look at that poll. Let's see here. What I was going to ask, and looks like I'm getting some poll results here in a second. For operating cost data, yeah, looks like most folks are looking for that data, same as we are. For standards and targets, okay, a lot of folks looking for that data too. And let's see, inventory data, we feel better about that, I think. And occupancy data, we're looking for that. So hopefully, I know that's not a very scientific poll, but hopefully what that does, I've indicated on here where I think Notre Dame is on some of that. Hopefully what this does is just give you some frame of reference for where your institution might be relative to your peers, maybe spark some conversation, some thought about, areas of focus going forward. And certainly, like I said, I'm happy to help out in any way that I can there. It looks like I have a question. Are we talking occupancy? I think when I'm talking occupancy, I'm saying which department is assigned to a space, and then specifically at the office workstation level, which person is assigned to a space. I think that's data that we're going to want to have. So hopefully I answered that question that just came in. Thank you for filling out that poll. I want to jump now to the second question in my mind, which was, what are the technologies we can use? Again, this is going to be a quick slide because likely this is all very obvious to CFTA members. But in the interest of just giving people a generic playbook, I'll say that at a minimum, you should probably have 2D, 3D software to assist with floor plan management. You should have a space management tool to collect and maintain your inventory and occupancy data. I think it's also very helpful to have a GIS platform where you can integrate and visualize space data from with other relevant and important information. And then I would just say, to the extent that they are configured the right way and have the right business processes, I think your asset management and work order management systems can help you identify operating cost data. I've listed on here the various systems that we use at ND for these things, and I'm very happy to talk to anyone offline about the way in which we use these systems. But I was trying to kind of breeze through this section and get to fun stuff. If we have this data and we have these tools, what can we really do to help our decision makers on campus as it relates to flexible work? So far, I have 3 ideas. First, I believe it makes sense to build at least some basic level of scenario planning model around flexible work. I built a very basic model that can be used at the campus or even unit level to understand the current use of office space and the potential impact of remote work, assuming you have at least some of the relevant data outlined previously. And I'll show you that here in a second. Secondly, I think it makes sense for those of us in the space management and GIS arena to be working on visualizations to help our leaders conceptualize what's happening with campus space. I am by no means an expert here, but I tinkered with some specific visualizations based on the model, and I will very humbly share those in a moment. And then finally, after working on this for a couple weeks, I think one of the best things that we can do to support our leaders is just ask good questions. So I have a list of open questions that are still on my mind, and I'm hoping we can discuss those further in the unconference that's coming up, maybe even answer a few of them in the year ahead. The first thing I tried to do was, like I said, I created a scenario planning model. And that sounds really fancy, but it's really just a big spreadsheet. And I wanted to see, what happens to space when I put different groups of employees at varying levels of remote. I'll be honest, when I started out this process, I kind of thought I was going to come up with some show-stopping numbers, right? I figured I'm gonna whip this thing and I'm gonna go into the president's office and say, look how much money I can save you, and I'm gonna spend the rest of my days on a golf course. And suffice it to say, that's why you build models. Once I realized that I wasn't likely to transform the budget model of the university, I set some more realistic goals for a simple model. Basically, use simple tools, keep it simple, use the data that I have, and I, don't obsess about the things I can't get. Make it scalable so it can be used at even the unit level, and really just make something that helps prompt questions and gives people an order of magnitude style estimate of impact. And I think those are good goals for any model that you all might try to build as well. I built this, like I said, as a Google Sheet. It's got a number of tabs that go through from left to right. In the interest of making this presentation smooth, I'm just going to do screen caps in here, but I'm happy to share this with anybody that wants to see it. And so basically, you start on the leftmost tab with what I call sort of pre-work. It's going to ask you to consider your cost data, and it gave you a couple ways to kind of think through how you want to calculate that. If you've got the cost by square foot, you can throw it in. If you've just got summary cost, you can throw that in, and it's going to calculate your square foot costs based on space data that you give the tool later. The next thing it does is ask you to consider any specific guidelines that may be in place for your university or for your business unit. One thing I've seen so far at Notre Dame, and again, it's very early in our remote work pilot program, there is not going to be one size fits all approach to this. Flexible work is going to look different in the finance division than it looks in the facilities division, even within Notre Dame. So this tab is prompting people to put in some guidelines, and then it reminds them of what they put in later in a tab where they're putting in remote work percentages for their specific roster of employees. The last of what I'll call sort of the pre-work is just asking users to adjust the available options for remote work. You can cap it at 40%, 50, 60, up to 100%, and then adjust the thresholds that they have for square feet per workstation and square feet per private office. Those become very important, as I'll try to show here in just a second. So now we make the magic happen. At Notre Dame, we have a system in place that allows users to view, if they have the right security and access, view and download a list of their assigned spaces within their unit. And this report and this downloaded data set has been integrated with our enterprise solution for employee office address data. So they get a listing that shows all their spaces, and then where there are employees assigned to those spaces, they see the employee's name and their ID information. For privacy purposes, I've hidden that out there on the right, but hopefully you can kind of see, the spaces at the top, there's nobody in them. And then as it moves down, you're seeing, some of the folks assigned to those particular spaces. This is all set up so that, when they download from that stock report, which is published in our EDW portal, they just got to copy, paste it into this tool, and the sheet's going to do the rest. The first thing that the tool does is generates a roster of unique employees from that pasted data, and it shows the employee, their current office location, and the square footage of that particular office. The user then goes through in that green column there to the right and inputs a percentage of remote work for every person on their roster. Once this is complete for everyone on the list, the tool will generate an estimate of the potential impact of remote work. But first, it's going to show them a summary of their current space. And this was something I added in after kind of working with this with a few sort of test cases. Basically, I think the reason to do this is I think this initial review of just the existing space and occupancy data can lead to some interesting questions. For example, do you have any empty offices? What is your current allocation of space, and how does it relate to our space standard or whatever targets you may have set? And, sometimes we just find bad data. But I thought it was useful to kind of insert this before showing people the big reveal. And I would just generally say, I think no matter how your institution implements flexible work, there's going to be a lot of focus on the use of office space going forward. And so it might be good to do an exercise like this just to help highlight situations that you may want to address around your space, regardless of flexible work implementation. I'll just say sort of winkingly, never let a crisis go to waste, right? And then finally, we get to the big reveal. How much space can we save? And I think the most important thing to say about all this is that everything here is an estimate. None of these estimated savings are realized by the institution until you actually repurpose or decommission the space. And I think the way to think about these numbers, the talking point I've been using with folks, is that this is really site planning as opposed to construction documents. That's a very facilities-focused analogy, but hopefully that works. Really what we're trying to do here is give leaders a broad idea of what flexible work might be able to do for their organization. As you can hopefully see on the screen, the items that I calculate are the total employees using remote work and how that relates to the total number of employees. I also estimate a range of recoverable workstations and recoverable offices and the square footage in each of those categories as well. And then finally, I do calculate an annualized cost savings, and I link to a very basic campus map visualization. Before I go any further, let's spend a minute and talk about how I calculated the savings and some of the nuance there. I think that's probably maybe the most interesting part of this. I'll try to do this with just a simple example, and I hope this clarifies the issue. But let's just assume we have 2 private offices and 3 workstations, and the employees in each space are going to work 1 day from home each week. And you can see my masterful clip art here, trying to distinguish between people with office doors and people in their workstations. If I assume that every 100% of remote work equals a recovered space, then theoretically I get a recovered space. But I think when you do the math that way, that's not necessarily realistic. I think you really have to divide private offices from open workstations to get a more accurate estimate. And so when you do the math that way, we use square footage thresholds that we have entered previously for open workstations and private offices. We get a different outcome and really a more specific and usable outcome. So just to walk through this, the threshold that I set for a recovered private office was 250 square feet. When I multiply the 300 square feet of private office space that I have times the 40% remote work factor, I get 120 square feet of recoverable space. This is less than half of my threshold and thus does not produce a recoverable space. 0.4 of an office is recovered. Conversely, when I do the same calculation with 240 square feet of workstation space and a 60% remote factor, I get 144 square feet of recoverable space. This is more than my threshold of 120 square feet, so produces a recoverable workstation. Hopefully that math makes sense. Obviously, this has some implications. First and foremost, the thresholds that you choose make a big difference. You'll want to think about those thresholds in light of factors at your institution. Notre Dame is taking a very conservative approach to all of this. And so even within our established standards, I chose the high-end thresholds. If I set the threshold for workstations at 80 square feet or even 40 square feet, both of which would be in the range of our published workspace standards, then we would get a lot more recoverable space. So I think one of the nice things about building this model is if I'm talking to leadership and I want to adjust that, I can go in and adjust those thresholds, right? And it may not be the same conversation with every group on campus or at any of your institutions. But generally speaking, I would just say I think that doing your calculations that way in a square footage based way is more conservative and probably would be my recommendation for whatever that's worth. As I tinkered with numbers and scenarios, I would say you certainly can calculate things with that percentage of remote work. But if you do that, I think that's sort of indicative of a much more aggressive policy that essentially would have to state that anyone participating in remote work, regardless of your office or workstation, is essentially giving up their dedicated office space. That's certainly not what it's going to be at Notre Dame, I don't think. But I mention it because there may be institutions for whom that's on the table. And so I just think it's important to think about, the 2 different ways to potentially calculate your savings and which might more appropriately fit your institution. I'll also mention that doing this exercise was useful for me because it highlighted that I might need some new attribute data. The way I did all this math in the sheet, I kind of had to do a little inference to come up with what's a private workstation and what's an open private office rather, and what's an open workstation, because I don't have that as an attribute in my database. So I was doing some back end math with square footage estimates, but that's certainly not the ideal way to do this. And so it's kind of taught me about my database and maybe needing to add some unique attribute data to distinguish as a hard-coded attribute, so to speak, what's a private office versus what's an open workstation. And then finally, I think I've mentioned this a couple times, but I'll pound this home, just, remember, however you calculate your savings, that you don't realize any of it until you actually repurpose or decommission the space. I mentioned that I created some pretty basic visualizations. Here's one of them. I'll be candid, I'm a little embarrassed after seeing all the things that were presented over the last 2 days to show this to a conference of such talented GIS and 3D BIM experts and everything. But, here we are. So I did make this in Tableau, which I know was mentioned earlier. Essentially, this is a version of our campus map that will show larger units where their space is allocated. I'm going to keep moving here and just say that I had a little less success, doing this at the floor plan level. I came up with some templates, but I was not able to figure out a way to automate this out of the tool. That's sort of the next thing I'm working on. But to be honest, I'm a little happy just to punt on that, because when I show this to people, I think what it results in is people trying to space plan immediately. And that's probably not where we're at in the process just yet. As I mentioned earlier, I have a lot of open questions still. And I think that's where I want to spend the remaining few minutes that we have, is just talking through what some of those open questions are, hopefully prime this for that unconference. If there was anything I learned in putting this together, I think the big takeaway for me was that I don't think there's going to be some big, windfall savings of space right out of the gate, at least certainly not for Notre Dame, but probably for many institutions. I think what you're going to find is pockets of space potentially, as opposed to entire floors, entire buildings of space. However, I do think that remote work and flexible work can act as a limiter on future office space expansion. And so the current thing I'm thinking about and working on is, can I find hiring trend or projection data that I can use to estimate, potential future savings, so that when that next unit comes to me and says, I need 10 more offices, I can say, well, do you really? And can we maybe manufacture, if not 10, maybe 5 of those just by adjusting remote work within your group? I will also point out, and I've linked in the show, in the notes here, there's a fantastic APA presentation out there that really goes through some of the reasons why I think we're going to have to think about this in the future. I won't belabor the point now. The link is there, but it's definitely worth your time to check out some of the trends that are coming. Very sobering. Always thinking about what can we do for students. Obviously, if we can save some money, can we use that in better ways for the students, right? Either through scholarships and fellowships or hiring staff and faculty for their benefit. Big one on my mind is, if I have these little pockets of space, what can I realistically do with them that's cost effective and productive? Do I want to start converting classrooms into, or conference rooms rather, into classrooms and make things dual use? Recently, SCUP put out a facilities survey that showed that, we're, as an industry, as a higher ed, across the nation, we're 8-to-1 offices to conference rooms. I don't know if that's heavy or light. That's what their pretty thorough survey showed. Is that what we want it to be in a new post, COVID world? And do we want to, maybe adjust to more collaboration space? And then, finally, can we do things to help our employees with health and wellness, right? As they are coming back in the office, do we want to be putting gyms in little pockets of office areas? Do we want to have mindfulness spaces, right? At Notre Dame, that might be a prayer room, lactation rooms. There's a whole host of things we could do from a health and wellness standpoint. I'm very much thinking, I know yesterday, I think FM Systems showed some survey data saying 42% of their users are looking for information on how to do hoteling. Count me in that group. I'm looking for current turnkey packages to do that and help my units, take advantage of space that they can recover quickly. I'm also thinking a lot about, do we have the right administrative infrastructure to manage the recovered space? I'm running short on time here, but I'll just say that, you're going to have to think about your procedures around space requests. Are you going to make it a part to think about remote work? Do you have the right policies in place? Do you have decision making centrally on how you're going to reallocate space? Hopefully we can talk in the unconference about my experience with our backfill committee. We reallocated 300,000 assignable square feet since 2017 with a centralized backfill committee at Notre Dame. And then, are you just able to data track as you need to? And then finally, what are the costs associated? There's going to be costs, right? Somebody mentioned this morning utilization, monitoring, and I think that's going to be one I'm certainly looking at. So in summary, how can space management support flexible work in higher education? Gather your data, leverage your technology, ask good questions, and then share the answers with your CFTA colleagues. Towards that end, my contact information is here. Reach out to me. Happy to share whatever I can with you. Right now, I'm going to kick it over to our president, Sue Stewart, for our closing announcements and remarks.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I appreciate it. I want to thank you all for taking the time to attend the 2021 CFTA virtual conference. Since most of our work is done online and your time and availability is limited, I'm thrilled that you chose to be here today. Our focuses for this event were innovation and moving forward post-COVID. So I hope you got some great information to take back to your campuses to help you keep moving forward. I want to thank again our generous sponsors. Without your support, we would simply not be here today. I appreciate the faith that you placed in our organization as a wise investment during a time of reduced budgets. I want to thank the campus community who inspire our leadership to continue to grow CFTA in meaningful ways. Thank you to Chris for his brilliant MC skills. I'd like to also thank our CFTA leaders who graciously volunteered their time. Our board of directors and officers are passionate about CFTA, and it shows. My final acknowledgement of gratitude is for our executive director and conference coordinator, most likely our MVP this year, Ann Hollins. The success of this event is due in large part to her tremendous efforts. Way to go, Ann. Like many of you, I hope that we're moving forward towards a new normal. But change seems to come fast and hard, so I hope you remain safe, healthy, and resilient during this next chapter of life. Please follow and connect with CFTA on social media. Visit our calendar of events to see scheduled webinars, virtual connections, and conferences for content throughout the year. Please connect with our business partners for Campus Solutions. Click on the social network link at the top of your members page to connect with other members. CFTA will leave the conference platform over the next few weeks and encourage networking, resource sharing, and consuming that content. Thank you again for being here today and showing your support for the CFTA community. Coming up next are our unconference sessions. Please join your room of choice for open discussions about flexible and hybrid work in higher ed, managing integrated technology for building safety on campus, all things BIM, our GIS maturity model for higher ed, and a deeper dive into yesterday's keynote about the Candida building. You can move around from room to room, and we encourage you to raise your hand in the chat to share. So go now and join up on the unconference sessions. Thank you and take care.